In 1698, Scotland was a poor country with expensive ambitions. The kingdom had a population of roughly 1 million people, an economy heavily dependent on agriculture and limited trade, and a financial sector that had barely begun to develop the instruments of modern commerce. England, its southern neighbor, with whom it shared a monarch but not a parliament, not a unified government, and emphatically not a unified trade policy, was becoming rich through imperial expansion. The English East India Company held monopoly rights over trade routes that were generating extraordinary wealth. English merchants and investors were accumulating capital that was being deployed into a widening empire. Scotland wanted in, and what Scotland attempted, in a single catastrophically misconceived venture, was to create its own equivalent of the East India Company, establish its own colonial foothold, and seize a position in global trade that would allow it to compete with the great commercial powers of Europe on its own terms. The plan was to build a colony at Darien, on the Isthmus of Panama. The colony would control the narrowest land crossing between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, taxing all trade that moved between them, and would form the commercial foundation of a Scottish empire. The plan was wrong in almost every particular, and the cost of being wrong was a disaster from which Scotland could not recover independently, a disaster that made the Act of Union with England not merely politically convenient, but economically inescapable. The Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies was incorporated by the Scottish Parliament in 1695. Its charter was extraordinarily broad. It granted the company monopoly rights over Scottish trade with Africa, Asia, and the Americas, rights that in practice the company had no realistic means of exercising, but that sounded magnificent on paper. The fundraising that followed was the most successful single capital raising exercise in Scottish history to that point, and arguably thereafter. It is estimated that approximately £400,000 sterling was subscribed, a figure that historians have assessed as representing somewhere between a quarter and a half of the total liquid capital in Scotland at the time. The subscription was drawn from every stratum of Scottish society: Edinburgh merchants and lawyers, Highland landowners, Edinburgh tradespeople, members of Parliament, the legal profession, and ordinary Scots who borrowed against their properties or liquidated their savings to participate. This extraordinary buy-in reflected the depth of Scottish resentment at English commercial restrictions, particularly the Navigation Acts, which effectively excluded Scotland from English colonial trade, and the genuine belief that the Darien scheme represented Scotland's chance to break free from economic subordination to its southern neighbor. The English were watching with hostility. The English East India Company lobbied successfully against the Company of Scotland in the English Parliament, which passed legislation threatening punishment for any English subject who invested in the scheme. King William II of Scotland, who was also King William III of England, refused to use his royal influence to protect the company's interests, having been warned by his English ministers that the Darien scheme threatened English commercial interests in the Americas and risked conflict with Spain, which claimed sovereignty over the Isthmus of Panama. The company was forced to raise its capital exclusively from Scottish sources. The London money that had been expected to participate evaporated. The Amsterdam bankers who had been approached withdrew under English pressure. The scheme that had been designed to raise £800,000 raised approximately half that amount, entirely from a country that could barely afford it. The choice of Darien was the scheme's most fundamental error. The Isthmus of Panama in the 1690s was not empty territory awaiting development. It was the subject of active Spanish colonial claim, backed by a Spanish empire that was militarily capable of defending its interests and deeply hostile to any European power attempting to establish a foothold in the Americas without Spanish consent. The idea that Scotland, a small, militarily modest kingdom with no significant naval presence in the Western Hemisphere, could establish a colony in Spanish-claimed territory and successfully defend it was strategic fantasy. Beyond the political and military problem, Darien was a terrible place to build a colony. The Isthmus of Panama is one of the most hostile disease environments in the Western Hemisphere. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and a range of other tropical infections killed Europeans at rates that decimated colonial ventures throughout the colonial period. The terrain was dense jungle. The soil was unsuitable for the type of agriculture the colonists knew. The trading post that the scheme envisioned, a crossroads where goods from both oceans would naturally concentrate, would require merchants from both sides of the isthmus to choose Darien over established routes and established trading partners. There was no particular reason they would. The first expedition of approximately 1,200 colonists sailed in July of 1698. They arrived at the Darien coast in November and established a settlement they named New Caledonia. Within months, the mortality rate from disease was catastrophic. The settlers had brought trade goods, woolen cloth and combs, and other products of Scottish manufacture that were entirely unsuited to the tropical markets they had expected to reach. The promised trading partners did not materialize. Supply ships from Scotland were not forthcoming. And crucially, following instructions from King William, English colonies in the Caribbean refused to provide any assistance to the Scottish settlers. No food, no medicine, no ships, no support of any kind. The first colony was abandoned in June of 1699 after losing approximately 500 colonists to disease and desertion. The survivors sailed away. Before news of the first expedition's failure reached Scotland, in the weeks during which the colony's true condition was unknown at home, a second expedition had already sailed, and then a third. The second expedition found the abandoned remains of New Caledonia and attempted to re-establish the settlement. The third arrived to find colonists in desperate condition. Spanish forces, aware that Scottish presence on the isthmus was unwelcome and strategically threatening, besieged the settlement in early 1700. The colonists negotiated a surrender, abandoned Darien for the second and final time, and the scheme that had consumed the wealth of a nation collapsed entirely. The total losses are difficult to calculate precisely. The financial investment of approximately £400,000 was almost entirely lost. But beyond the direct financial loss was the human cost. An estimated 2,000 colonists who died, primarily from disease, in the jungles of Darien, and the economic consequence of having drawn so heavily on the limited capital of a small country and destroyed it. Scottish merchants who had borrowed to invest in the Company of Scotland were ruined. Landowners who had mortgage estates could not service their debts. The credit markets contracted. The economic damage was concentrated and severe in ways that compounded the initial investment loss. The political consequences were equally severe and ultimately decisive. Scotland in 1700 was economically weakened, diplomatically isolated, and locked out of the English colonial trade that was the dominant engine of wealth in the North Atlantic economy. The Navigation Acts still excluded Scottish merchants from English colonial markets. The company's capital was gone. There was no realistic prospect of raising new capital for another commercial venture on the scale required to compete with English or Dutch commercial enterprises. The English, watching their neighbors' distress and seeing an opportunity to resolve the persistent friction of a shared monarch governing two separate kingdoms with often conflicting interests, began serious negotiations for political union. The terms of the Act of Union, negotiated between 16 and 17 and 17 and 7, included a financial payment to Scotland, the equivalent, that was explicitly designed to compensate Scottish investors in the Company of Scotland for their losses. The equivalent, approximately £398,000, was widely recognized at the time as a payment designed to buy Scottish consent to union. Robert Burns, writing nearly a century later, described the Scottish parliamentarians who voted for the Union as having been bought and sold for English gold. The characterization is polemical but not entirely unfair. The equivalent was a central element of the negotiation, and the financial desperation that Darien had produced made it effective. The Act of Union came into force on the 1st of May, 17 and 7. Scotland and England became a single kingdom, Great Britain. The colony that was supposed to make Scotland independent ended the independence of Scotland.